Let me ask a general question to start, which is, how does all of this stuff that's happening inside us to our microbes interact with our own attempts to have an immune system?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think there's probably two things to say there. So partly, I think we don't appreciate enough just how much of a battle is going on. So for example, people think a lot, which is good, about their microbiome these days, and many of you will be eating things to balance your microbiome. But part of that balance is also about those microbes fighting each other, right? They're fighting for resource. The bacteriophages are killing some bacteria, not others, so on and so forth. And then the debris they're producing is also part of our immune response. So for example, if a bacteria dies and releases its contents, your immune system will pick those up and use it as a process to respond differently to that bacteria next time. So the output of all this is kind of complicated interplay of ecosystems. And I think there is a lot more we could learn about that, and probably a lot more we could harness about that, particularly actually for difficult to treat sites. So for example, I spent a lot of my life working on diseases that attack the brain, and the brain is very difficult to treat because you can't just open someone's brain up and deal with it. So things like bacteriophage treatments, I think, could be really beneficial in those kind of bacterial meningitis, for instance. However, first we've got to work out whether killing all your bacteria with a bacteriophage might unleash some massive immune response that is in itself dangerous. So there is understanding that ecology, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah, there's a system here. It's not these, you talked about sort of single examples, but they're all interacting as well.
Exactly.
Excellent, good. Questions in the room. Let's start, we'll start right down the front here, if that's right. There's a microphone coming towards you right now. I will fill a little bit while that happens. No, next one along, thank you.
So Mimi viruses, you said that they can construct some of their internal structures without needing to be inside a cell. Presumably that means they have a natural, consistent metabolic load. Does that affect how capable they are of remaining in dormancy?
That's an interesting question. So the Mimi virus, the Mimi virus is not fully alive in the sense that although it can construct some of its own machinery, it's not doing that in the absence of a host cell. So if you take Mimi virus or any other giant virus in a tube on its own, it will not be metabolizing, it won't have a metabolic load. When it goes into a cell, it sort of occupies this weird zone between being semi-independent and producing some of its own machinery and semi-dependent. And so I think it would be very difficult to disentangle what's the kind of metabolic process of the virus from what's the host cell. And so part of a question I think that remains unanswered is why is the virus doing this? Why if you can be a super simple COVID-19 with just a few genes, why would you have this much more elaborate genetic basis? And we don't really know the answer to that. I mean, one possibility is it might give a broader range, because if you're, for example, so if you think about influenza, typically most influenzas are quite species specific, but they can't just use any old protein machinery from any old cell. If you have your own protein machinery on board, it's a bit like having your picnic with you. You know, it doesn't matter if there's no restaurant, you can still do that bit, but you can't live forever like that. So it might broaden host range, but we don't really know the answer.
Excellent, thank you. Great question. The question online, which is about CRISPR, which you took us through in wonderful clarity. And the question is whether this perspective helps us understand what we could do about the potential misuse of CRISPR. In particular, concern that somebody could target particular groups without their consent, if you're thinking about infection and so on.
Oh, that's interesting. So I mean, people talk about misuse of CRISPR or genetic technologies generally in sort of two different ways. So the first way is when something happens by accident that you didn't intend. And actually, I think in most senses, CRISPR is much better. It's a much more precise tool than biotech tools we've had previously. So, for example, the idea that you're trying to create a crop with extra vitamin D, and actually you produce a crop that's going to kill people, is far less likely with CRISPR than it is with other technologies. So that's inadvertent. Deliberate misuse is a bigger worry, probably, because it does offer the potential to be highly specific. So if you really wanted to, you could probably create some kind of CRISPR that, for example, was lethal for men but left women untouched, which no one in the audience is cheering yet, which is good. But you could do something like that. The big barrier still is delivery. So even if you were to do that, the kind of medication, so the blood medication we're talking about, requires multiple infusions in a hospital setting. You can't just sort of spray it around your supermarket and everyone gets it. But we don't know where that will go in the future. So it's absolutely something we need to be mindful of and bear in mind, I think, whilst at the same time not sort of slamming down the shutters and never doing anything.
Great, thank you. Now, another question in the room. Let's go, sir, in the red jumper 3 back here. Yeah, thank you. Microphone coming, and there we are.
Thank you, Robin. What is the ultimate process? Is there a perpetual digestion of cells goes on forever?
Oh, I see. In terms of the immune cells, you mean? So in terms of the white blood cells, when a white blood cell eats a pathogen, it starts digesting it. It will essentially repeatedly that indefinitely for its whole lifespan. It will give up in one of two ways. So it will give up if it reaches a physical capacity. And we don't really understand how it works because it could in principle grow, but at a certain point it seems to say, okay, I've had enough, I'm done. Or, more likely, it gives up when it's had too much damage. So sometimes these bacteria fight back, sometimes there's just natural damage from UV, from DNA damage, and it kind of realizes it's weakening and it's got to kill itself then. But in principle, there is no fundamental reason why you couldn't have a cell that would eat and eat and eat forever and divide every so often and carry on. But those don't seem to exist in the immune system, and that is probably because a cell that never knows when to stop growing is essentially a cancer. And so it's not it's not unrelated, the fact that many of the most common cancers are cancers of white blood cells, so leukemias, because these are a cell type that is used to growing very repeatedly, and so it's quite easy for mutation to drive it from dividing a lot to dividing forever and therefore causing cancer.
So a couple of similar questions online, which is quite fun. One person wants to know whether there are microbes which infect bacteriophages, and then anticipating the answer to that, somebody else wants to know, is there an end to this? Are there identified microbes that are too small to have a pathogen?
I'm hoping that is there an end to this isn't is there an end to this lecture, because God, it's going on forever. So as far as I know, and I stand to be corrected, there are not currently viruses of bacteriophages known. Conceptually, you could imagine a scenario where you had a sort of satellite virus that could only survive when you've got a bacteriophage in there. Bacteriophages are quite small, so it'd be quite hard to package the additional information for that, probably. Is there an end? I mean, in principle, there's partly an end based on physical constraints, in the sense that DNA is a certain size, so you can't get smaller than that. And also there's sort of a definitional end. So, for example, prions, which are the thing that causes BSE or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, so these prion diseases, are single proteins. They cause disease, but they're not alive. They're a single protein. So that's even smaller. But do you define that as a kind of life form? I don't, but it does kill people. So there's a sort of semantic argument too.
Okay, we shall leave semantics and come to a question that's right down here in the front. Sorry, you're making the same track, but yeah, so in the blue microphone is coming towards you as we speak.
Blue shirt. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you.
I've read that scientists trying to reconstruct Luca, the last universal common ancestor, have found evidence that it had a primitive immune system. Do you know whether that's true, whether it indicates that the battle goes back really to the origin of life, even before the Luca where with mechanisms, organisms died out?
Yeah, good question. So Luca, for those not familiar with it, it stands for last universal common ancestor, i.e. the kind of organism that spawned all life at some point. And the way that people are reconstructing that is by working out sequence everything we have in the world today and work out what's in common, and you sort of go back, like going back through your family tree, you go back and back and back and back until you can't go back any further, and you assume that was the first common ancestor. So the two answers, I think. So first of all, almost all the evidence we have is that when any life form evolves, it has pathogens and parasites almost immediately. So I think it is reasonable to assume that very early in history, the first cells that had independent life would also have had pathogens associated with them. So most viruses, for example, originate from our own DNA, and they've kind of broken free and formed their own life. So that could have happened for Luca too. One caveat, I would say, is that many of the machinery, or the bits of the machinery that drive immunity, are also used for other things. So, for example, that process of cell death, where the cell kills itself and kills its bacteria, is also the same process used during development. So, for example, when you're a fetus, you have webbed fingers and toes, and as you develop, the webbing dies off by that same process. And indeed, you sometimes have people who are born with webbed fingers and toes, because that process hasn't worked very well. So it is quite hard, if you see something in a genome, to be sure that it's there as an immune process. It might be there for some other function, and it's been later co-opted into immunity. So it would be quite hard to definitively answer that. But if I had to bet, I would say, yeah, the first bacteria or whatever they were probably also had very swiftly thereafter viruses of themselves.
Brilliant stuff. I think that's a good point to end on. So let me just finish by reminding you that we're just at the start of our academic year here at Gresham College. So I think there are about 100 or so lectures left. You've got charismatic leadership tomorrow, Baroness Catherine Ashton on European security on Monday, and maths in Shakespeare's time next Wednesday. And most importantly, Professor Robin May's next lecture is on the 27th of November, when he'll be talking about how immune systems protect us. But before all of that, please join me in thanking him again for a wonderful, wonderful talk.
Thank you.